Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to talk about Plasmic integration with React Hook Form. So by using a React Hook Form and utilizing the code components feature of Plasmic, we're going to build really dynamic web forms inside the Plasmic, and it will let you define custom UI for your input elements, and it will provide all the form functionality, that is submitting the form data from a parent component, error handling, and default values as well. So let's quickly go through the React Hook Form API. So it has a bunch of ways to basically integrate the forms in the React, but the one that we're going to be using in this tutorial is form provider. So we will use the use form context API of React Hook Form. So the form provider component utilizes the React context API to provide its state or the form state to the nested component, so that way we can actually design our form UI regardless of where the input field resides inside the React tree. So it will help us in that, and the controller component is responsible for registering the our input field component with the form, so that we can provide default values for that particular field, get the state of let's say the error state of that particular field, and it will help the input field communicate with the form back and forth, so that the logic is intact. Alright, so if we go back to our visualization, so these are the three components, or you can say the basic component that will lay down the structure of our form. So we will need the form code component to basically wrap all of our input fields inside a form, and the main functionality or the responsibility of form code component is to provide the form state, the default values, the error handling, and all of those stuff to the child input fields. Alright, so let's look into the visualization, and these are the three basic code components that we will need to basically design. Alright, so let's look into the visualization and understand the overall structure at the high level. So these are the three basic code components that will help us integrate React Hook Form with Plasmic. So the first one is form code component, and the responsibility of this code component is to provide the form provider wrapper, and it will actually provide the form state and error handling, and it will perform it will call the on submit function, and all those stuff reside under this particular component. And inside the Plasmic Studio we will be able to wrap all our input fields into the form component, so that we can basically differentiate different forms and collect the data individually. Alright, the next component is RegisterFormField. The purpose of or the responsibility of this code component is to register the input fields with the form, and the way to do that, as we looked into the React Hook Form API, is through controller API. So this component will internally use the controller component from the React Hook Form, and it will actually register its children, which will be the input fields, with the form provider. Alright, and the third code component will be related to the input fields that we want to basically connect with the form. So it can be of different types. We will have input fields, that is to collect text input. We will have checkbox input, date field, select field, and all those fields that we actually have in our forms. So for each input field or for each field, we will actually create one code component, so that we can actually use those particular fields inside the Plasmic Studio. Alright, so that's it for the visualization stuff, and now we will move on to the code, and we'll see how we can create these code components and then compose them together to get the final results. Alright, so before diving into the code, I have created a sample project inside the Plasmic Studio, and it's already configured with the like this app host is already set up, and we can register the code components. And I have already registered test component just to test out the registration process. So it's a simple component which receive a name as a prop, and simply use that name as a placeholder, and we can display anything over here. Let's say hello world. So I have already done or test out the registration. So before moving forward, please make sure that you have already set up the Plasmic host, and your registration is working fine. So if you are new to the code components, so please watch my previous video on how to register the code components. Alright, so now we are good to go, and we need to register the form component first. So first of all, I have a nice structure over here where we have a code components directory inside the source folder, and here I will create another folder for form component. So let's name it form, and we can create a file form.jsx. Alright, so as we discussed previously, the main or the primary goal of this component is to provide or wrap the form element inside the form provider, so that the child elements can have access to the form methods or the form fields. So let's quickly do that. First of all, we will use React Hook form, obviously, so make sure that you have already installed it. So let's add it to the project. Yarn add React Hook form. Alright, it's done. So what we can do now is we can use the use form hook from React Hook form, and it provides us with different methods related to form submission, form validation, and handling the error fields and registering the fields for us. So what we can now do is use a form element as a base, as a root element, sorry. Alright, and we need to basically wrap this form element inside the form provider. So to do that, we will import the form provider from React Hook form provider, and we can wrap our form element like this. Perfect. And the form provider should have all the methods, so we can just destructure the methods over here. Perfect. And alright, so the primary responsibility of the form is to handle the submission. So to do that, we will override the onSubmit method, and to connect it with the React Hook form, we will destructure the handle submit method from the methods. So we will say handle submit, and we will create our custom function handle form submit, which will be equal to handle submit, and here inside the handle submit we will add another function as follow. So it will receive the data, and we can for now just console log the data, and we will pass on the handle form submit to the onSubmit function or property of the form. Perfect. Let's remove this and replace this with children. We will destructure the children prop from the component props, and this looks good. Alright, so now we want to also support the form submission from the parent component. So in that case, we will be receiving onSubmit prop from the as a prop, so as a prop to this component, and we will call this function if it exists inside the handle submit method. So in this case, we can basically override this callback from the parent component and delegate the submission to the parent component. Perfect. Also, we now want to support the default values as well. So the way to do that is to basically provide default values to the use form hook, and instead of providing the default values over here, we will receive the default values as a prop, and we need to make sure that the component re-renders every time the default values changes. So for that we need to add the use effect, and the use effect will re-render every time the default values changes, and whenever the default values change we need to reset the form, and to do that we will destructure the reset property from the use form hook, and we will call it over here. So the reset function accepts an object to basically reset the default values, so we will pass on the default values as the first argument. Alright, so for now we need to just remove this and provide the default values as a dependency array, and also we need to provide the reset function as well. Perfect. So this is the only thing that we need to do inside this component, and let's rename this component to form CC just to have a good naming convention for code components. So form code component. Alright, and now we need to register this code component inside the Plasmic Studio. So to do that we will create a function below that, and let's name it RegisterFormCC. Here we will call the register component from the Plasmic host, so it is automatically imported over here. And the first argument of this function is the name of the component, the component itself, so we will pass on the form CC over here. The second argument is an object, so we will pass on the name as form CC. This should be exactly the same as the name of the component. Let's give it a display name of form CC, and let's give it an import path of, so the import path should be relative to the source directory. In our case the source directory or the code components reside inside the source directory, like this, source/code components. So to give a relative path from the source directory, we will simply say /code components. Alright, so the final path would be /code components /form, and inside the form, like over here, code components form and form. Perfect. And it's a default export, so we'll mark that property as true, and the final property is the props that we want to expose. So for this component we only want to expose the default values and the children prop. So what we can say is that default values is of type object, and the default value is empty object. Another thing that we want to expose is the children prop, so it's of type slot, and we don't want to provide any default values as of now, but the thing that we want to do is to hide the placeholder. So what this will do is it will hide the placeholder inside the Plasmic Studio that appears when there is no content inside that slot. Alright, now we want to call this particular function. So what we can do is inside the code components, let's create a file name as registerall.js, and here we will call registerall. So the responsibility of this function is to basically do all of the registration for us, and inside the Plasmic host we will only call this function. So it basically it's more of related to the structure of the code. So let's import the RegisterFormCC and call it over here. Now we can import the RegisterAll inside the Plasmic host and simply call it like so. Now every time we want to register any new component with the Plasmic Studio, then we can simply add the registration over here. Perfect. So after doing so, let's refresh the project and see if the form CC component is available inside the studio. Alright, so if we go to the components, and here we can see the form CC component is now available. So let's use it inside the root element. And let's import or sync down the changes just to make sure that everything is working fine. After syncing down the changes, let's refresh the local host, and yeah, everything looks good. Sometimes when you do mess up the import path, then after syncing down the project or the project changes from the studio, you will see there is an import path error over here. So we don't receive that error. That means that everything is working perfectly fine. Alright, so the next component, as we discussed inside the visual representation, is the RegisterFormField component. So let's create another folder over here. Let's name it RegisterFormField and add another file with the same name. Alright. So the field that every field inside our form should be registered with the React hook form, and the way to do that is either through the register function call. For example, inside the methods we will receive a register function. So we can say something like input, and we will pass on the properties returned from the register function call. Let's say we want to register first name, so we can say we have an input field and it should be registered with the React hook form. So this is one way to do it by using the register function. Another way to do it is through the controller API. So we want to create a controllable input fields. So what we mean by controllable is that the values and the on-chain function will be passed on as a prop to our input field. So we will use the controller API from the React hook form. So what we can do is simply import the controller function from the React hook form, and the controller function will receive a control prop which will say that this field is controllable and from the React hook form, and every time we provide any default value, then that particular value will be received by this particular component and it will be passed on to the input field. Alright, so the control property will be destructured from the use form context. So the use form context will utilize the context API and will receive the methods, all of the methods from the form provider. So inside the method we have another property that is called control. So we can pass on the control to the controller. Here name is the required field and it is the name of the field input. So instead of giving a hard-coded name over here, we will receive the name as a prop. So we will destructure it over here. And the last property is the render. So render will receive a function, and inside the function it will have a bunch of properties related to field, and the one that we are interested in is called field. And inside field we have other properties such as name, on blur function, on change function, the ref of that particular field, and the value that's currently stored in that particular field. So instead of destructuring them, we can simply pass on all those fields to all our children elements. So to do that, let's restructure the code. Alright, so here we will simply return the children, and we will pass on all the properties inside the field as a prop. So to use the react.clone element, it's a good idea to basically validate the children element. So to do that, we'll simply say react.isValid element children. If it's a valid element, then clone that particular element, otherwise render null. And here we have missed out a curly bracket. Perfect. And we need to basically destructure the children from the prop, the component props, sorry. Perfect, this looks good now. So let me just repeat the primary responsibility of this particular component. So its main job is to basically register fields inside the React hook form, and the way to do we are currently doing it is through controller API, and controller API is following the render props pattern, which means that it delegates the rendering of the input element to the consumer, and here we further delegate it to the children. Like whatever children we receive from the Plasmic Studio will be rendered over here, and it will receive the on change and the value property from the React hook form. Alright, so and also we want to style this particular div from the Plasmic Studio, so we will simply destructure the class name prop and pass it over here like so. And I think we have missed this class name property inside the form CC, so let's add it over there as well. Class name, and let's pass it down to the form. Sweet. And let's register this RegisterFormField component with the Plasmic Studio, and let's rename this to CC suffix as well. Alright, so we'll follow the same procedure. We'll create a function register form field CC, and here we'll call the register component from the Plasmic host, and the first argument is the component itself, so we'll pass on the register form field CC. Second argument is an object of property, so we'll give it a name of register form CC. This name should exactly be the same as this one, so we'll just copy paste. Display name should be register form field CC. Import path is relative to the source directory, so which is code components / register form field / register form field. Alright, it's a default export, so let's mark it true, and the last argument or the last property is the prop, so that we want to expose, and the first one is the children. It's of type slot. We want to hide the placeholder. The second property that we want to expose is the field name, so let's expose that. It's of type string. Default value, you can left it empty, but I'm gonna provide the unnamed. And the last property, I think we only need these two fields, the name and the children. For now, yeah, this looks good, and this should work fine. So let's call this particular function inside our register all function like so, and let's just refresh the project, and we'll be able to see the register form field CC function inside the studio. Alright, so under the components section, we can see the register form field CC is available, and let's use it as children of form CC, and simply sync the changes down just to make sure that we have used the right import path and nothing crashes at the moment. Perfect. So let's refresh the page and everything looks good so far. Alright, so the last step is to register the input field and use it inside the Plasmic Studio. So before going into that flow, let's visualize the upcoming flow, and we will follow the same procedure for each input field that we want to register or we want to use inside our form. So if you want to register the input field, we will use the same procedure. If you want to register the select field, a date field, a custom field, any kind of field that you want to use inside the form, we will follow the same procedure. Alright, so let's quickly go through some visual representation of the upcoming flow. So on the left we have the Plasmic Studio, and on the right we have the code base, and we want to register a text field inside our form. So the first step is to basically design this particular field inside the studio, and we will design the input field. So if it's a text field, we will design the text field. If it's a select field, we will design a select field, and so on. Like, just for the same flow is going to be for the date field, any custom field that you want to use inside the form. So we have let's make sure that we have designed that particular element inside the studio. Then we will sync the changes inside the code base. So the next step would be to sync down the whole changes inside the code base. So we now have the text field available inside our code. It's perfectly working and interactive, but the state of the input isn't persistent, or we don't manage the state of the input at the moment. So what we need to do is to manage the state of the input. So we will manage the state, and we will make this component as a controlled component. What does that mean is that we will pass on the value and on change as a property, and the state of the input will be controlled by these two properties. So after adding that particular state inside the text field, we will re-register this component inside the studio. So the last step would be to register the text field CC, that is the code component version of this particular text field inside the studio. So inside the studio we now have another component available, that is text field CC, and this is the same component that we already created, but it has its own state and it's interactive, and you can add any kind of business logic over here. But the idea is that this component is a controlled component. It can receive a value and on change property, and internally it will use those particular function and the property to update its state, and we can actually use this particular component inside the RegisterFormField CC that we have already created. So this whole flow is going to be the same for every new field that we want to use inside our form. So let's code it down. Alright, so let's go to the studio, and the first thing that we need to do is to use the text field. So by using the text input, it will create the text input by default for us, and let's remove it from here. So this is text input. Let's assume you have your styling done and all of the design is completed. So the next thing is to sync the changes. So we will sync down the text input. Alright, so the text input is now available inside the components, and you can see it doesn't store the value or the input value inside the component at the moment. So what we can do is add a local state to this component. So we can say const state, input value, set input value, use state. Default value is going to be empty, and we will add these inside the input element. So the value is going to be equal to input value, and on change we will call the set input value e.target.value. Alright, so now this particular text input has its own local state, and the last step is to make it controlled component. So to do that, we will receive the value and on change function as a property, and we'll add a use effect for the default value. So every time the value changes, we will call the set input value or update the local state. Another thing that we need to do is that every time the input value changes, then we want to call the on change function that we receive as a property. So to do that, we will add the input value into the dependency array, and we will call the on change function. Alright, so yeah, this component is now a controlled component as we discussed over here. So we have done the first, second, and the state and the control component step, and the last step is now to register this component as a code component version. Alright, so to do that, we can simply follow the same procedure and add a function over here, register text, or let's create a code component folder over here. So let's say text field, we can say text input, text input.jsx, and it will import the text field from text input from the components. So we will utilize the same in text input component, and that's why we don't need to create any other component for now. So what we can say is export const register text field or text input cc. Here we will call the register component from Plasmic host, and we will pass on the component text input. We will give it a name of text input cc, and by default this component will be imported from this particular file. So what we can do is we can export text input as text input cc, so which means that this component is now available as text input cc, and we can pass on the text input cc name over here. Alright, let's give it a name of text input cc. Import path is gonna be /code components /text input. And another thing, is it a default export? No, because we have exported it as an object. So what we can say is default export is false, props, and we want to expose the value prop for now. It's of type string, and default value is going to be empty. Alright, so let's call this function inside the register all function. Import it and call it over here. Let's refresh the project and see if it's available inside the project. Alright, so if you go to the component section, and we now have text input cc available, and what we need to do is use that component inside the RegisterFormField cc, text input cc. Cool, and let's sync it down just to make sure that the import path is correct and everything looks good. Perfect, so it's now working fine. All we need to do is to submit the form from the parent component or from this particular page, and we also need to check the default values is working fine or not. So what we can do is we can give the register form field CC a name of, let's say, a first name. And now we have already used or added the logic of controller API, so which means that this component will register its children, which is the text input CC with the form, and the form can now provide default values to this particular input field. So to test it out, we can add the default values over here, and we can say first name is equal to ABC. Save it, and you can see it is directly reflected inside the field. So which means that the default values are working fine and all of the integration is perfectly working fine. So what we need to do next is to add the submit method or add some functionality inside the form CC so that we can call the on submit from the parent component. So one way to do it is to go to the Plasmic homepage or the homepage component. So where is it? Components, and alright, so yeah, it's going to be under the pages. Sorry for that. Inside the index, here we have the Plasmic homepage, and we can access the form CC using the camel case. So what we can say over here is form CC, and I always render something else just to make sure that I have overridden the exact property. So let's say hello world, and this doesn't work. Let me change it to, yeah, this one be a small c. Yeah, it basically changes the form to hello world, so which means that we have used the same the property that we need. Alright, so what we now need to do is pass on the on submit method, and this property will be passed on to the form CC that we have registered. So inside the form, this on submit will be received over here, and it will be called over here. So what we need to do now is go to index. It will receive the data, and here we need to do is console log the data. Alright, so this function will only be called when the form is submitted, and inside the form we haven't yet added any submit button or anything like that inside the children, which will trigger the on submit. So let's quickly go through that, and let's add a button over here. It should go inside the form CC. Let's give it a compact size. Let's give it a name of submit. And this colon is coming from my code component. I guess we can fix that later, so let's just focus on the form. And let's add a vertical stack and move the children inside the vertical stack. Perfect, so let's give it a rows gap of 16 pixels. Let's remove the default values for now. Perfect, so it doesn't re-render. It happens sometimes in the studio, or it might be the case that you have some error inside the code component. So for now we will just refresh the project and see if it reflects the changes inside the code component. Alright, so it looks good, and let's rename this button to submit button, and what we can say is let's just sync it down. Alright, so let's go to inspect and network tab. Let's say go to console. Hello. Yeah, and once you click on the submit, it actually triggers the onSubmit method of the React hook form, and inside that it triggers the onSubmit, or it calls the onSubmit function that we have passed on, which actually logs the data for us. So this way we can add the submit method to the form as well. And if you want to trigger or the onSubmit from the parent component, that is, let's assume that the submit method or the submit button lies outside the form CC. So what should we do now? Because if we sync this down and we try to call the submit method, then it won't trigger the handle submit of the React hook form. Alright, so if we clear the logs and call the submit method, it doesn't work. So how can we call the submit method or trigger the submit method from the parent component? So to do that, we will add submit method to the ref of the component, so that we can basically reference this form outside the form element or outside this component and trigger the submit method. Right, so we will use the ref that is provided to this component. So let's get that argument, and we will use the react.use imperative handle to basically attach some properties to the ref. And to do that, we will add the first argument ref, and the second argument is going to be the object that is going to be attached to this particular ref. I think it's not an object, it's a function. Yeah, it's a function which will return an object. Yeah, and the last argument is the dependency array, so we can keep it empty for now. Or yeah, so here we want to attach the submit method to this particular ref, and this submit method will simply call the handle form submit. Alright, so I think we don't need this dependency array. Let's just test it out. So if we go to the home page, and which is index.jsx, and here let's attach a ref to this particular component. So let's say ref is equal to form ref. Let's create that ref over here. Form ref is equal to react.use ref, and let's simply console log form ref. So if you go back to the component, what does it say? Cannot add property, current object is not extensible. Alright, so to fix that, we need to wrap our component inside the react.forward ref, so that the ref is or the ref properties are forwarded, or React can do the internal stuff. So what we can say we can do is to rename this component as form cc underscore and create a new variable form cc. It will basically use the forward ref function and wrap the form cc underscore for us. So what this does is that it will export a component which actually use the forward ref component, and it wraps our previous component inside the forward ref, so that React can do its internal stuff with the ref and forward the ref to the child component. Alright, so if we go back to the home page, and it should exactly look the same, right? And if we go to the browser and refresh the page, we can see that the form ref has the current attribute and it has the submit function attached to it. So what we can do now is simply call the form ref.current.submit on submit button. So we have named the submit button as submit button, so we can access it as a camel case on click, and here we can simply say formref.current.submit, and to add a check on the formref.current, if it doesn't exist and we simply want to return. Perfect. So what we can do now is go back to the browser, clear the log, and just simply add a data and click on the submit button. Nothing works. So what we need to do is debug it out. Alright, so after doing some debugging, I have made a silly mistake over here. We need to check for if the formref.current doesn't exist and we want to return. So it was because of this if condition, it was doing some early return over here, and the function wasn't even calling this particular line. Alright, so just add the not condition over here and we are good to go. So let's remove this console log, and now let's clear the logs and click on the submit method or submit button. You can see we received the on submit data over here. So yeah, that's pretty much it, and let's just play around with some components. So let's assume that we now need to add another field for the last name, so we can simply duplicate this register form field CC, and let's rename it to last name. The children will be exactly the same, and this should just perfectly work fine. Let's sync it down. And let's give it some default values as well. So also we can pass on the default values from the code as well. So let's say we want to say default values is equal to first name is going to be equal to last name, last name equal to 1. And let's go to the page, and you can see the default values are reflected over here. Let's change them to theme, and let's simply click on submit button and we can receive the data over here. So yeah, that's it for this video, and we will have some follow-up videos on how to register or improve this form component to support error handling and do validation and all those stuff, and also to add extra fields such as select field, date field, and how even we can create our custom fields such as custom checkboxes that will render images and will have different styling apart from checkbox and some basic elements. So we'll see. Alright, so if you like this video, please like and share and hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.